This episode we're taking time with somebody who's taking time
You guys want to
a little bit different. Hey, a guy who's served in an elite role in the United States Air Force and then went on to a rocket ship-like career in law enforcement. What do you think is the bravest act that he's ever done? You might be surprised when you hear very specifically from Sergeant Michael Sugrue today, the bravest act that this warrior, this law enforcement officer has ever done. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn things over to my guest, Michael Sugrue, as he tells you the bravest act he's ever made.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.
Hey, Michael, before we even start this conversation, I want to tell you, thank you for serving the country. Thanks for what you've done for your community and for the state of California, man.
Thank you, brother.
I love guys and gals that carry a gun. I love what they stand for because, to be honest, most people don't want anything to do with the scenarios or the situations that somebody with a gun has to go to every day, all day long. That's your job. And you did it both in the military and in law enforcement. And I got mad respect for both. So it's great to talk to a guy who has both sides of the house.
Thank you, brother.
Here's what I want to get to. I'll just tell the audience where we're going to go with this, and then we'll back up and we'll kind of make our way here. You're a guy who's gone through some pretty intense stuff in the United States Air Force. You've gone through even more intense situations in law enforcement in your community in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. And man, I've seen guys that have really gone through stuff like that. They have been rewarded. They've got all of the accolades. And then I've also seen, and this has been very, very rare, but I've seen a time or two where the institutions that they love and serve have kind of turned their back on them or hurt them in the past. And what I'd like for us to eventually get to is the organizational betrayal, where you've given your heart and soul to an organization, and in the end, they treat you like it doesn't really matter. And that's a part of your story that I want people to hear. But when they hear all that you've done, I think most people are going to say, how on earth did a guy like this get treated like that? So can we go back to early days? Can we go back to you joining the United States Air Force out of college, becoming a security forces officer, and not just doing that, but doing some pretty impressive things during your Air Force career? You want to talk us through the Air Force?
Absolutely. So I got commissioned in 1998, went in as a second lieutenant, and my first choice was security forces, which is basically anti-terrorism, force protection, law enforcement, nuclear security, foreign airfield assessments, a whole bunch of cool things. I ended up serving all over the world, all over the U.S., Europe, the Middle East, and South America. I was a Phoenix Raven, which is a subset of security forces numbers. We're actually given a unique identifier. It's a number that only we get. It's an order. Mine was 1173. And for me, it's one of my proudest achievements. But basically, the whole premise of the program with the Phoenix Ravens is they're part of the air crew. And they go to hostile environments or dangerous areas, and they're directly responsible for the protection of the air crew and the aircraft. And they also do duties like air marshal duties on contracted airplanes, or airfield assessments. And really, I was living my dream. One of my biggest regrets is actually getting out of the Air Force. I got out in 2004 as a captain. I was stationed back in California at Travis Air Force Base.
Yeah,
And I
right
was
in the
at
San Francisco area. Know it well.
Correct. And I was the chief of security forces there. Deployed TY 14 times my last year in,
Wow.
and was loving it. I mean, literally loving it. But, my longtime dream was to always go into civilian law enforcement. I come from a law enforcement family. My stepfather, who raised me with my mother, he was in law enforcement. And so I knew eventually I was going to get out. But again, my biggest regret is I wish I would have stayed in the reserves and still gone into civilian law enforcement. But I look back now, and honestly, some of the greatest times in my life were in the military. And what I think is very unique, most people don't realize, but I think the camaraderie, the brotherhood is much, much stronger in the military than it is in civilian law enforcement. And we can get to that, but there's just really a 9-day difference between the two.
Yeah, you already answered this for the audience. A guy who's leaving college, joining the Air Force as a commissioned officer. If you know, I want to be security forces, if that's your first choice, then obviously there's something in your past that's moving you towards law enforcement. For the listener out there who's not aware of it, security forces are kind of the law enforcement for the Air Force, but they actually work across the U.S. military. I've been on lots and lots of installations overseas, lots and lots of fire bases and military bases in combat zones that were secured by the U.S. Air Force security forces there. So obviously you have somebody in your family that you're looking up to and that's giving you some advice before you even start your Air Force, let alone your California law enforcement career.
Absolutely. I mean, he's the sole reason why I did this. He was my hero, in every single way. I looked up to him physically, figuratively. He was a great husband to my mother, a great father to me, and I strive to fill his shoes from a very early age.
Yeah. That is a priceless treasure that not everybody has. And to have a man like that, that you can, a hero like that, that you can look up to in the home, man, those are rare today. Okay. So you got a number. Listen, most people that have a number, they don't, a number associated with their name, they don't want anybody to know about their number because we're talking somebody who's been incarcerated. But your number, 1173, is not only unique, but it's incredibly elite. Um, you described a little bit about what the Phoenix Ravens do, but just to set the stage for the audience a little bit, I was on early in the war in Afghanistan back in 2003. I was in the middle of the desert. We're surrounded by mountains, and I have a tent that's right next to just a flat piece of desert. And sure enough, once or twice a week, somebody would roll out there. They would put a couple of bright orange panels on the ground, and here comes a U.S. Air Force C-130 that would land in the middle of the desert right next to our tents. And those security personnel would get off, make sure that everything is safe around the aircraft while cargo gets loaded off and loaded back on. And then the aircraft does a turn and takes off. The security people jump back on and take off. And I thought, do you know how challenging this would be? Because that airplane can land in some pretty remote and austere places, and there's absolutely no friendlies anywhere around you. And so the Phoenix Ravens are the guys and gals on the back of the aircraft that make sure that that crew is safe and that aircraft gets out of the same landing strip that it landed on. You want to talk a little bit about your time as number 1173 of the Phoenix Ravens?
Yeah, I'd say my greatest memories were in South America, in Colombia, and this was back in 2003. And back then there was still a high risk to being kidnapped. There was the FARC, the revolution. There was
Yeah,
aircraft that crashed, and people were
I
taken
remember.
hostage.
Yep.
And I just remember being out in the middle of these jungles, in the middle of nowhere, and doing assessments on airfields, for suitability for future Air Force and joint operations. And it's kind of unique because in the Air Force, we do live it up. And so the time that we're out in the field, we're out there, but we come back. So we just we're staying in like 4-star hotels. I mean, eating well, having fun. And so it's always a nice mixture of having a good time and then danger as well. So, and quite the balance for sure.
I would agree with your statement. Whenever I was, as an Army guy, whenever I was around the Air Force, I often said to myself, man, these folks know how to live it up when you're back in the base. But when you guys go out, man, you go out in the middle of it, you go right out in the thick of it like everybody else. And the Phoenix Ravens doing stuff like securing nuclear missiles, doing airfields assessments in the middle of the jungle in Colombia. I mean, that stuff is no joke. And it just talks about how professional you must have been as an officer and a leader in the Air Force.
Yeah, from day one, I had a great NCO, and I owe it all to him. I'll never forget my first assignment. I sat down with my commander, I was working for a missile squad or nuclear missiles, and the lieutenant colonel sat me down next to my master sergeant, my flight leader. He said, "Hey, see this guy next to you? He's been doing this job, for the last
Forever, right?
2 decades, and
Yeah.
he knows the missile field like the back of his hands. But more importantly, he knows his people, and he knows how to lead. He knows how to manage." And she basically said, "You know what? Sit down, shut up, and listen to this guy." And that's what it's all about. When you're a brand new bottom bar, yeah, you're coming out of college, you've been through basic training and all that, but you really don't know anything. And I owe my success to, phenomenal non-commissioned officers who paved the way, showed me the way. And I think that's really important for people to understand that it's a team. When you're talking about the military, it's a true team environment at all levels. And no matter what rank you're at, whether you're an officer, non-commissioned officer, we rely heavily on each other.
Yeah.
And that made the key difference for me.
That was genius advice that you got. And I agree 100% with everything that you said. More than a couple of times, I had to remind, as a sergeant in the Ranger Regiment, I had to remind some brand new officers to the unit, like, hey, boss, I realize you're in charge. I realize when you make a decision, we're going to go out and execute that decision. But you just need to know I've done missions like this 30 times already. So you might want to just listen to some advice before we go out and do something crazy. But if you don't, we'll go do what you tell us to do. I'm just saying, I've done stuff like this about 30 times already. So the transition for me out of the military was not easy. I thought it was going to be, but it wasn't. And for the exact same reasons that you just mentioned, the camaraderie in the military, I haven't found it anywhere else. I had hoped that I would find it in the church, or I'd hoped that I would find it in some groups of people that I hang out with. But what I had in the military was special. It was unique. So when you transitioned, you went from security forces in the U.S. Air Force to law enforcement in the San Francisco Bay Area. Let's go into that part of your career now.
Well, let's start with the academy. So I have a funny story, and on the first day, we had to do before the actual academy started, when we were processing the physical fitness test. And I was actually still on active duty. I was on active duty for
right.
the first couple months of the academy, my user lose, my terminal leave.
Yeah, right.
And I remember I showed my flight suit, my beret, my captain bars. And 'cause I was actually working, so I went on my lunch break to do this run and do
Let
this
me go
test.
do this. Let me go knock out this physical test on my lunch break when everybody else has been training for it for 2 years.
And then it turns out the RTO, the basically training officer for
Yeah.
our academy, he's fire listed Marine. And so
I
from
bet
that
that
day
got his
on,
attention. Yep.
he got his eyes on me from
I'm
day
sure.
one. But it was definitely a transition because I went from being a leader, being a manager, being in charge of sometimes hundreds of personnel to starting all over at ground zero, going through a police academy, where basically I had to redo everything.
Yeah, you're
and go
basically
through.
restarting a new career all over again. And all that you've done in the Air Force doesn't count here, right?
Exactly, and there's a lot of major differences between civilian law enforcement and military law enforcement. But I will tell you, and this goes to your talk about the camaraderie and the closeness. To this day, as we sit here, and I went through the academy in 2004, the people that I went through, the men and women, are some of my best friends, just like the friends from the military. And what's ironic to me is that I'm actually closer to my police academy peers who didn't work for my department, they worked for other agencies, than people from my own police department. And what I learned very early on, especially for me, I worked for a medium-sized department in the San Francisco Bay Area. So we had like over 125 personnel, close to 90 sworn officers. I learned it was a very competitive, cutthroat environment because anytime there was a special assignment, anytime there was a promotion or unique opportunities, like everyone was literally out for themselves. It was like, like a feeding frenzy. And, I did very well. I was very successful. My hardest transition, I think, was to stop saying yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am, and being so rigid and formal because I was so used to a formal rank structure to go to an environment where it's paramilitary. I mean, we're in uniforms, we have ranks, but most people, the first name basis, it's a much more relaxed environment. And I also had to learn that, people in the civilian world, they don't listen to you like they do in the military world.
How about that?
You
Yeah.
know, and not especially being a commissioned officer. Can you imagine being an Air Force captain, security forces, a Phoenix Raven? I used to people doing things when I tell them to do things. And, when you're a civilian police officer, it's the polar opposite of that. And, people don't comply, they fight, they run. Every potential contact that we have is a potential deadly
Yeah,
threat.
of
And I don't
course.
think most people understand this. I equate it to, a lot of military members when they go off to combat, they're a defined hostile zone. The threat is generally known. They're there for a set period usually, and at some point they leave that hostile environment and they go back to their home station or their home base. Well, in law enforcement, we're literally in combat every single day. Up to, 30 years now, people working 30-year careers in law enforcement, and we're literally in combat every single day. And I think, the general public just really can't fathom what that means or what that feels like to be on constant high alert, never fully relaxing. On duty, off duty, and it's so ingrained that you have to constantly watch your six. And but I'll tell you, that adrenaline, that rush, I loved it because I that's part of the reason why I left the military too, is that as I moved up in rank, it was less hands-on, less field work, and I didn't want to be stuck in an offense. And now, so here I am. I finished the academy. We go through a field training officer program where you team up with another seasoned officer for 4 weeks at a time. You go through several officers, and I was captains. And man, I hit the ground running. I was stopping
I
everybody,
bet.
making arrests, 2 arrests a day, usually like 13 to 16 tickets a day, 30 stops in a shift. I was working the graveyard shift at night. I loved it. Just the sense of excitement and never knowing what is around that corner. And I missed it. I truly, truly missed it. But again, successful career. I was an officer, then I was a field training officer where I trained not only new officers at the academy, but officers switching departments. I was a detective. I was actually undercover on a California State Drug Task Force, so basically like the California DEA. And that was everything. That's what I strove to do. And I won't go into great detail in here. It's in my book. But a couple of years into that assignment, it all came crashing down. And it turned out that my boss, who was a state agent, was actually stealing our evidence and was selling it on the side, doing a whole bunch of illegal operations. Basically, it shut everything down. It shut down my dream of what I was doing. And I got promoted shortly after that. And then I was running teams on the street. And that's really where my story starts, where I'm at today. I was involved in a very critical, tragic incident that changed everything for me.
Yeah, before we get into that, I want the listeners that are hearing you to pay attention to what you just mentioned. In the military, any country's military, they go off to war. It's a determined war zone. It's a specific amount of time. And we should honor and respect the military. But in law enforcement, literally every time you get out of the car, every time that you go to work, every time that you get a call, you're in a potential firefight that could cost you the rest of your life. And to live with that relentlessly every day, all day, day in and day out, I'm convinced that law enforcement deserves as much, if not more, respect than the average guy or gal in the military because of what you do for a community. And when people start to run the military or the law enforcement down, I remind them, like, you live in a country where if you dial 911 on your phone, a lot of people are going to come to your rescue. There are places on the planet, because I've been there, where there is no one to call for help. And I know what that kind of hopelessness feels like. So I that's why I started this interview by telling you, man, thank you. Thank you for your service in the military and the Air Force, but thank you for what you've done to keep evil at bay in California and in the San Francisco Bay Area. And obviously, you've been around combat, you've been around trauma, you've been around blood and stuff like that, both in the military and in law enforcement. And guys and gals that are around that, for a lot of times, they can spend a lot of their life feeling like I'm 10 feet tall and bulletproof. It might happen to my partner or somebody else on the force, but it's not going to happen to me until you get this call in December of 2012. You want to talk everybody through that incident that you were just leading up to?
Absolutely. First, I just want to paint where I was at in life at that point. I was happily married, had a beautiful daughter that was 2.5 years old, had just bought my dream house. My career was off the charts. I literally been promoted faster and quicker than anybody had at that point. And now I'm literally out there, running a team. I'm in charge, and our shift was a graveyard shift, so it started actually on December 26th and went
A
into the
day
morning
after
of December
Christmas.
27th.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, so now I always associate this incident with
Yeah.
Christmas.
There goes your
And
there goes your Christmas, right? For the rest of your life, you think about this at Christmas time. Yeah.
exactly. And so, because it was the day after Christmas, we had minimum staffing. Most everyone was off. I would basically, when I started the shift at 9:30 at night, there was an overlapping team, but they went home at about 1 a.m. And so when they went home, I was the only supervisor on duty for the entire city. I only had 4 officers at that point.
Hold on just a second. You've got all of San Francisco Bay Area is now your responsibility.
Well, no. I'll
Not,
clarify that. So not San Francisco Bay Area, but the city I worked in, Walnut
okay.
Creek, is in the San Francisco Bay
Yeah.
Area. So at that point, we had one single dispatcher. I was the only supervisor, and then we had 4 officers.
Good
And
gracious.
this was our Friday.
Yeah.
We were going to be off for several days. Everyone's in a great mood. The shift is slow, not much going on. And about 3 a.m., I start reviewing reports because I want to go home and get back out of there and start my weekend. And suddenly, the female dispatcher gets on the air, and her voice is like unlike anything I've ever heard before. Very frantic, very high pitched, and she says the address and says that basically there's a woman inside a condo and a man armed with a knife. And so immediately, I start just driving as fast as I can. Lights and sirens are on. There's no traffic this time of day. I can hear all the other officers are answering up on the radio, so they're starting to go to that location. And in my mind, I'm thinking like, okay, you're in charge. I start thinking about the supervising stuff, but I also start thinking about, what we need to do as an officer. And so about halfway there, the dispatcher gets on the radio and says, now the boyfriend and girlfriend are barricaded inside their bedroom. And I was confused. So I actually asked for clarification on the radio, and I said, is the boyfriend the one with the knife, or is there a third subject armed with the knife?
Is it a domestic dispute or is it a home invasion is what you're trying to figure out, right?
Exactly, or how many people are there, and
right,
who's
yeah.
the one that's armed. And she quickly clarifies that no, there's a third subject armed with a knife. And so now, my adrenaline is just pumping,
Sure.
and I'm just imagining like this horrific scene that I'm about to go to.
Yeah,
and I'm trying to get there.
in a bedroom is not a good scenario.
Not at all. And I know this general area, but this is a condominium complex. So basically, it's rows of attached 2-story condominiums.
Mm-hmm.
And I know where the complex is, but I don't know where this unit is. And so I pull up. It's a very dark street. It's all basically high res condos and apartments. It's basically one lane in, one lane out. I pull up in front of the complex, and as I start to get out, the dispatcher starts screaming, going, units, there's a trouble. And then she lost connection inside. The phone line went dead. So we had no more communication inside the condominium. And
So
thank
now
God at the same time, one of my officers, a female officer, is pulling up right behind me. So it's just her and I at this point. And we can hear blood-curdling screams coming from the distance. Literally, we don't know where this unit is, but we look at each other, our guns are out. We start running towards the sound of these screams. Eventually, we have to crawl underneath an outside stairwell, and we get into this open courtyard with condos all around us, 2-story attached condos. We end up getting right in front of the unit, and it goes from blood-curdling screams to just eerie silence. I don't remember seeing anybody, hearing anybody. There's nobody else outside. Now it's just her and I know I've got more officers coming. but we've got to get in there. We've got to save this couple. And so we announce ourselves, guns are out. Please come out, show us your hands. Nothing. I tried kicking open the front door several times. It doesn't work. My partner motions to a huge window, a louvered window the size of a door that smashed into the condominium. And so we both post up at this window. She looks at me, I look at her, she goes in, I'm right behind her. That puts us in this kitchen area immediately. And there's glass everywhere. The kitchen's disarray. We exit the kitchen. She goes right. That puts her at the base of the stairwell, and the locked front door is to her back. I go left down the hallway. I clear the living room, family room area. I don't see anybody. No signs of disturbance. I don't hear anything. I come back at the base of the stairwell. And now my partner is to my right. We're literally shoulder to shoulder, touching shoulders. To her right is a solid wall, and we're looking up a dark staircase. And we can see on the top left, there's an opening. We don't know if it's a room, if it's a landing. But again, we've got our guns out. We have mounted lights on our firearms, and we're yelling, please come out, show us your hands. Nothing. I mean, this seems like eternity, but I'm talking about a very
of course
short period of time.
Sure. Time stands still when you're in a scenario like that. Yep.
It does. Eventually, a male subject partially comes out, but we can't see the entire right side of his body. He's at the top of the stairwell. He's sweating profusely. His eyes are wide open. He's literally staring straight through us as if we're not there. And we're yelling, show us your hands, show us your hands. He's not moving. He's not reacting. I don't remember his eyes blinking. I don't remember facial expressions. I don't remember him moving at all, just staring straight through us. At some point, 2 more officers come inside the condominium, a male officer and a female officer. I immediately yell for one of them to get the taser. Less lethal force. So the male officer says, I've got the taser. He positions right behind myself and that first female officer. So the 3 of us are at the bottom of the stairwell. The last officer goes perpendicular to the stairwell with her firearm out. Suddenly, the male comes all the way out. My partner yells, he's got a knife, he's got a knife. And in his right hand, he was clenching a full-size kitchen knife, a huge knife. And again, just staring straight at us. And now we're yelling, drop the knife, drop the knife. No reaction.
Good gracious.
Suddenly, he comes up, knife over his head in a stabbing position, starts coming towards us. I shoot. Other officers shoot. I don't know if I've hit him. He's now at the base of the stairwell, still clenching this huge knife. I don't see any blood. I don't see any injuries. 2 of the officers relocated to the family room area. The male officer, the taser, dropped the taser. He has his firearm out. So literally, he and I are literally like 3 feet away from this guy armed with this huge knife. And all we know is he's between us and the couple upstairs. And we don't know if they're bleeding out, if they've been stabbed, if they're dead, but we've got to get to them. And so we're yelling, drop the knife, drop the knife. He starts coming back up with the knife. I shoot. My partner shoots. Devastating. Absolutely devastating. I mean, his eye was gone, blood everywhere. I mean, it was obvious he was no longer with us. I had the officer check vitals. There were none. Medical is already staging. I called in dispatch, shots fired, send in medical. I had 2 of the officers go upstairs, and thank God we got there where we did, because this subject had been stabbing through the bedroom door with this huge knife, and the door was coming off the hinges, and this poor couple was physically barricading their bodies against this door, trying to prevent him from coming in as he was stabbing through the door. And I know today, I have no doubt, had we not gotten there when we did, they would have been killed. I had no doubt. But that incident changed everything for me in a blink of an eye.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, this guy with an assailant with a knife invades my home, and is stabbing his way into a bedroom, is every person's worst nightmare. And although you've been highly trained, although you've been around really tough situations before, this kind of killing 3 feet away is very close. It's very intense. And I'll just say it for the audience. You'll never get that out of your head for the rest of your life. You just used the words, everything changed after that. And I know a little bit about your story. So I want people to know how your perfect world came undone after this incident. Can you talk us through what happens to you emotionally and psychologically and even spiritually next?
Absolutely. I made a lot of mistakes, and early on, I made a very bad decision that I would never bring work home. I would never talk about the job with my family. I thought I was protecting them
Yeah, sure.
by doing this. And so, at this point, I had been a civilian officer for 8 years, in the Air Force for 6.5 years. I had been exposed to hundreds and hundreds of traumatic incidents, but I never processed them. I never talked about them. I never dealt them. I just basically thought they would just go away. They would never penetrate my armor. And so when this incident happened, I didn't have that established support system. I didn't, have that relationship with my wife at the time. I didn't believe in the resources that our agency had, like peer support, psychologists, and therapists. And so, when the shooting happened, first thing that there was two parallel investigations. So there was the, investigation from the outside district attorney, and there was an inside IA investigation, and
Internal
we were
affairs,
ordered.
for anybody who's not familiar with that phrase. Go ahead.
Absolutely. And we were ordered not to talk about this incident with anybody. Now, of course, protected communication with my wife would have been allowed, but I didn't take advantage of that. And so I let it bottle up. And I literally, when I got home that day, I remember I felt detached. I felt like something was off. And all I wanted to do was go home, you go to sleep, and hope this was some nightmare that didn't happen. But unfortunately, it was reality. And I started having the constant nightmares, this face, this image of this guy that was trying to kill me. I couldn't get it out of my mind. And I started drinking too much, trying to medicate myself, self-medicate so I could actually fall asleep. And I got into this vicious cycle where I started isolating, where I didn't want to be around anybody or talk to anybody. And literally I just wanted to drink myself to sleep every night. But then again, every morning I'd wake up and the problems were only worse at that point. And so we were off for 2 weeks. And right before we went back to work, and we were cleared eventually, both by the in-house investigators, by the district attorney. But I just wanted to go back to work as soon as possible. And so did everybody else in the shooting. And so when we had the critical incident debrief, we all used that as a fact-finding mission because we had no idea what the other ones saw, what they did. In fact, just as an example so the public understands, that second round of shots, I thought it was actually the same female officer that arrived with me that was involved in that second volley of shots. I didn't learn until 2 weeks later it was actually the officer with
The
the
other
taser.
officer that showed up. Yeah. Wow.
Exactly. And so we were just trying to fill the pieces in. And so we all went back to work right away. And, when I was at work, I was operational. I mean, I was good to go.
Of course.
You put
Yeah.
that
Because you
badge.
figured out how to put that side of your life off to the side while you're in the uniform.
Exactly. One thing I didn't mention, though, we were sued immediately by the family. So a $15 million civil lawsuit
Hold
that
on.
eventually.
You got to say that again out loud for the audience to hear. The guy who tried to stab his way into a bedroom, the guy who's coming at you with a knife even after shots fired at him, his family sued you.
Yes, $15 million lawsuit within,
Holy
I believe,
smokes.
a week of the shooting, before even the investigations were done. And the
That's
thing is,
crazy.
this is the thing. This is back in 2012. So imagine today in the climate, much, much worse. But the thing was, this incident that I wanted to forget, I couldn't forget it.
Yeah.
I had to remember every finite detail
Yeah.
because every year we had to go through depositions where the father of the man I killed was sitting directly across the table from me in a tiny room where they were videotaping us and recording every word that we said. And eventually, so 4 years later, September of 2016, on 9/11, no less, federal civil trial in San Francisco, one of the worst places you could be on trial as a cop, and a civil lawsuit for taking someone's life with a firearm. Now, and I'll never forget, when they were collecting the jury pool, about a third of the prospective jurors, they actually thought that officers shouldn't even have guns
Oh
to
my
begin
word,
with.
man.
And here I am on trial right? Oh, and you know, one thing I need to tell the audience is the guy that tried to kill me had an identical twin brother, and he was in the court proceedings 4 years later. So this faith, this
So
image, this
you're
nightmare,
looking at the exact same face that you pulled the trigger against in the courtroom every single day.
unimaginable,
Wow.
unimaginable. And so my life is falling apart. By the time the trial goes, I'm getting divorced. My marriage is over. I'm fighting for custody of my daughter. My hero, my stepfather, he got diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, dies months later. I start being repeated skin cancer diagnosis. Things are going wrong at work. I mean, it was getting so bad. It got to the point where I didn't want to be here anymore. I literally started putting myself in dangerous situations, hoping I got killed in the line of duty. Because I thought if I died in the line of duty, my daughter will always be taken care of. I'll be remembered as a hero. I was tired of the pain. I was tired of the suffering. I never once had a plan to take my own life off duty. But I put my judgment, my officer safety, my decision making aside and purposely put myself in high risk situations hoping I got killed.
I'm going to let you in on a secret. I don't know that I've ever said this publicly before. I wrote a book about situations exactly like this because I've had a few friends who have gone through something traumatic. And as a result, they've just decided, I don't want to live anymore, but I don't want to be branded as a coward for killing myself. So I'm going to do something in the military that no one will ever know, but it is going to cost me my life. And by the way, then my family's going to get this huge insurance policy and people will think I'm a hero. And the phrase that we use behind closed doors is, I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory. And so I wrote a book literally entitled Blaze of Glory about a guy who's struggling with PTSD and he's ready to basically run into an enemy situation and hoping that it'll cost him his own life because he's struggling. And it's what I'm trying to say, Michael, is it's not you. I've met many people who have gone through the same logic as you. Like, I'm going to go out. I'm going to go out at work. I'm going to go out in a very spectacular way. And no one will ever know that it was intentional that I ended my life. That way, my family gets the insurance money and I look like a hero. But in reality, I just don't want to live anymore. And man, that is very dangerous. I know this firsthand. That's highly tempting. So why didn't you? What happened that prevented you from actually stepping into traffic or actually stepping in front of a hail of bullets or stepping into a situation where you knew this was going to cost me my life?
So the trial ended September 2016, and that Thanksgiving, about a week after that Thanksgiving, I was on duty. I was a day shift patrol sergeant, getting ready to go home, and a suicide in progress comes out in our city. It turns out that that was one of my best friends. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was an MP. He was also a 35-year reserve officer with my department. He had retired a few years earlier. We rode together for years. I mean, we had lunch all the time and we talked all the time. But he was going through a bunch of things in his personal life, and I didn't ever realize the extent of what he was going through. So he never talked about it. And I remember I got to the trauma center as the ambulance brought him in. He was covered in blood. He was in and out of consciousness on the gurney, and I literally had like 30 seconds before they rushed him off to emergency surgery. And I remember looking him in the eyes, telling him he was going to make it. You know, you've got this. But in my heart, I really didn't think he was. And I remember sitting there for hours in the hospital with his sister who had driven out, with people from my agency just wondering if he was going to survive. And all I could think about was my daughter. You know, what was going to be the effect on her? She was 6 years old at this time. And
Yeah,
what was going
sitting
to be
in a
the domino
hospital room
effect?
doing what you're doing right now, right?
Exactly. And so thank God he survived. I tell him every day when I see him that he saved my life by trying to take his own life. Because a month after that, on the anniversary of my shooting, I remember I'd gone in that gym. He said that day I go every day to relieve stress and just wasn't working. I remember going out to my car and just bawling for 2 hours of what a mess my life had become. But thank God I got the strength and courage. I was ashamed and embarrassed at the time, but I know today It was the strongest, most courageous, bravest thing I've ever done. Nothing in the military, nothing in law enforcement, but it was me finally realizing that I needed help, that I couldn't do it myself. And that phone call saved my life.
I want to say that. I want you to say that one more time. For a guy who's done all that you've done in the U.S. Air Force, all that you've done in law enforcement, you just used the words, the bravest thing I've ever done. Say it again. What was the bravest thing you've ever done?
Pulling out that cell phone and asking for help is the most courageous, bravest, strongest thing I've ever done in my life. It was nothing in the military or in law enforcement. It was me asking for help.
It feels like every episode of this podcast, we talk about somebody who got low, somebody who tried to get through it on their own. And a lot of people, guys and gals, they ended up wrecking their life trying to handle their problems on their own. And then finally, they make the call for help. And every single episode that somebody's made that call, they've used the exact same words. It was the most important, the most powerful, the bravest thing that I've ever done. I've said this for 3 years now on this podcast. Like, if you're out there listening to Michael's story and if you're struggling, don't try to fix it on your own. In fact, that's insane. Michael's life story is proof that you get low enough, you can't fix it on your own. You need help. And the only way you'll ever get healthy is to do the bravest thing that Michael's ever done. Pull out your cell phone, make a call, and just tell somebody, anybody, I need help. And just saying those words, I need help, may be the thing that literally saves your life. Had John not attempted to take his own life, your friend from Vietnam and from the force, had he not attempted to take his life, maybe you never pull your phone out and maybe you never make that call. Because John's attempt on his own life was the wake-up call for your life, right?
Absolutely. And I remind him because he had so much shame still to this day.
Oh,
And I tell
man.
him, I said, John,
Nothing to be ashamed about.
no. And I remind him, I said, you saved my life, brother. Absolutely saved my life.
Hey,
And-
Michael,
and-
sorry to interrupt. We're going to hit this at a run because I know you've got a very limited schedule today. There's two things that we still need to talk about, and I really want to spend a moment or two on both of these. Would you talk about the moment that the organization kind of turned its back on you, and use that to set up for the listeners why you released the book Relentless Courage and what you're attempting to do with the book? So can you go ahead and bring the interview to a close, talking about these two really important parts of your story?
So when I first asked for help, my agency was very supportive. They got me the resources I need. I was aligned with a culturally competent therapist. I was going to weekly meetings for first responders. I went through the West Coast post-trauma retreat. I mean, I was making real progress. And my goal was to always go back to the job. I mean, this is all I've ever wanted. This is all I've ever known. It's a calling for me. And I remember, this makes me so angry, but when I left the West Coast post-trauma retreat, that program literally saved my life, changed my life. And part of that program, we had to have a 90-day plan, like a 1-year plan, all the way out to like 5 years. Well, part of that plan for me was because I had become so obsessive, compulsive with taking selfies of my daughter and I, because I wanted her to remember me when I wasn't here. They said, no, you've got to start making real memories with your daughter. You've got to start doing some meaningful things with her. Stop taking these selfies. And so part of my plan was, and again, I'm in the middle of my divorce, fighting for custody. I've never even taken my daughter out of the county at this point. And I make a plan that I'm going to take my daughter to Disneyland on Father's Day weekend, right? And so I pick up my daughter from her mom. I've got her bags packed, and she's in the back seat on her booster seat. And I pull out her Mickey Mouse ears. It's got the veils engraved in the back. And
All right. I hear you.
I say, baby girl, we're going to Disneyland, right? And I took a picture, I'll remember, and I still have it. And I posted it on social media. And at that time, I was friends with everybody in my department. I was a PIO. And so we're driving down there. We're staying at the place that we used to stay as a family. This was a family tradition. But right before we get there, I get a phone call. I let it go to voicemail. And it turns out it's my HR person and one of my administrators. And it sounds like a nice message. The same night, we're calling to check on you to see how the retreat was. We haven't heard from you in a while. And it was close to the day. So it's like, 3:30 now, but if you get this the next hour, give us a call. And I just let it go. I'm like, you know what? This isn't urgent. I'm focused on my daughter. This is what I need to do. So we get to the hotel, check in, we're down in the pool, the hot tub, and the next morning, we've got the plan. We're getting Mickey Mouse pancakes across the street and we're hitting Disneyland. And so we actually got up early. We're at breakfast. I'm getting ready to eat, and my phone goes off. And again, I see it's the city number. But the A tied to me checks the voicemail right away. Well, now it's that same administrator, and the whole tone is very different. And it goes basically like, Mike, this is so and so. We tried calling you yesterday. We haven't heard from you. We don't know where you're at. You don't have any plan vacation on the books. And if we don't hear from you by this time, you need to report to my office on Monday morning by 8 a.m. And I'm thinking, like, what is this guy talking about? Like, first of all, I'm off on injury. I'm not like on light duty. And not only that, I posted the damn picture that I'm going to Disneyland with my daughter. Everyone in the world knows about it, but he didn't mention that. And so I told my daughter, I said, I'm really sorry, baby girl, but we've got to go back to the hotel before we go to the park. I've got to call my boss. This is where everything changed. I remember I called him and I was excited to tell about my progress. And I was telling him all these things I didn't even have to. I was telling him about the things I was doing, the progress I was making. And he's like, well, do you have a date when you're coming back? And I said, well, sir, I don't have an exact date. I said, but I can tell you that I am coming back. I'm making great progress and I will be back. I just can't give you an exact date. And this is where the whole conversation changes. And he starts talking to me about retirement and talking about if I, agree to retire, he can make it very easy for me, no hurdles. And I said, sir, I appreciate that, but I have no intention to retire. And this is my dream. And so eventually, end the phone call, I go to the park, but I can't get this conversation out of my mind. It's just stewing. Go through the weekend. I end up getting home, and a day later in the mail, I get this certified letter from the city saying, we understand that you may have been out of the area, and per policy such and such, you're required to put in leave.
No.
Da, da, da. And let me tell you, I'm still in California. I literally drove my daughter on Father's Day weekend, right? I couldn't believe it. And so that started a whole series of events that I go into great depth in my book about institutional betrayal, administrative betrayal. But that's where I found out that all of that sacrifice, all that hard work and dedication didn't matter. They either wanted me back right now or they didn't want me at all. And this is where I realized I was just a number filling a position. And so as hard as it was, fast forward a little bit, I finally made the decision in August that I can't do this anymore. Like I cannot do this job anymore. I can't have an agency that doesn't support me. Like I just been through too much. I waited too long to ask for help. Well, as soon as I let them know I want to retire, they decided to drop an investigation on me for something that supposedly happened a year and a half earlier that not only held up my retirement, but at that time, California had a law, and they still do, it was a new law at the time, that if you were convicted of this, I would lose everything. I would lose my retirement.
Oh my goodness.
I could have faced jail time or prison time. I mean, these accusations were outlandish. And so at that point, I literally thought about taking my own life. But thank God I used my resources and I pulled out my phone and called a friend. But I had to hire another attorney, and that held up my retirement another 9 months. And eventually I was cleared on everything. Like, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I absolutely couldn't believe it. This is what I thought was my family, right? That had my back. They basically left me out on an island when I needed them most. And I'll be honest with you, in my work in law enforcement, my work now as a peer, I speak across the country. I get messages almost daily from readers and listeners of my book. But the number one thing that is resonating with people is the administrative betrayal or institutional betrayal. And in my opinion, the horrific things that we see and deal with, it takes a toll. Don't get me wrong. But in my opinion, what pushes most people over the edge in suicide is when our green family or blue family turn their back on us. That is what hits us most. It hits us straight to our core and straight to our soul. So I medically retired in 2018. And I could have just gone away and lived a quiet life, and that would have been it. But I knew that God had a higher purpose for me. About a year later, a guy I didn't know, his name was Danny Bird. He ran a podcast. I'd never been on a podcast. I never shared my story. Turns out, and he was big into fitness. He's a former cop. He basically harassed me for months and he got me into a corner where I
wore
kind of
down your
said no.
defenses until you finally said, yes, I know what you're talking
Right.
about.
And this is what changed everything for me. So I agreed to do it. He actually drove over 2 hours to come up to where I was.
Wow.
We met in the back of this Mimi's Cafe. I thought we got practice, get to know each other. I walked back there. He's got cameras.
He's got it. He's got the whole show rolling as soon as you got there.
And he's like, I've only got an hour and I've got to get out of here. I've got to get back down to the South Bay. I'm like, oh man. But here's the thing. I sat down. I strapped those headphones on. He started asking questions. And I didn't think about how to craft an answer. I didn't think about what sounds good. I answered everything straight from my heart. And we finished the interview. And I was so worried. I was so thinking when this thing airs, people are going to reach out to me and give me hate messages and look down upon me. And this anxiety was just built up. But when that aired, I started getting messages from all over the world, from Canada, from the UK, from Australia, from all over the US. And these people started sharing their stories with me. And this is where I realized, man, everyone has a story. We're not alone. And parts of my story were resonating with all these people I'd never met, some from other countries. So that led to podcast after podcast, speaking. But here's where the book comes in. And this is a cool story. So I never planned on this. Again, I know everything happens for a reason. Right before COVID, Dr. Shauna Stringer, she's a clinical psychologist, a former VA psychologist. She had written 3 books. I didn't know her. She didn't know me. She sends me a message on LinkedIn and says, hey, I love the work that you're doing. I'd love to just have a quick chat with you to tell you about what I'm doing. So I'm like, yeah, sure, let's do this. So we set up the phone call. I tell my story to her, what's in the book. And she asked me afterwards, she says, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I kind of laughed and I said, well, I've been asked this before and I briefly thought about it. I said, I'm just burnt out. I don't have that same focus and concentration and drive because of post-traumatic stress injury. And so we left it at that. A week later, she calls me back. She's like, look, Michael, I've heard hundreds and hundreds of trauma stories, but your story is sticking with me, and your story is going to save countless lives. And she said, I want to do this book with you. I want to make this happen. I haven't even met her in person. And I said, I knew in my heart, I said, let's do it. COVID happens. First almost year, all via Zoom. We didn't even meet. And eventually, we got to Relentless Courage, winning the battle against
There's the cover for everybody who's watching on YouTube.
Now, here's the deal. This is what makes this book unique. And as far as I know, there's no other book like this in the world. So every chapter has 2 parts. The first part of every chapter is my story told in my voice, all the way back to childhood. With the exception of one chapter, my Vietnam friend, the one that saved my life, he has his little chapter. But the second half of every chapter, Doc Stringer comes in, she breaks everything down, she explains it in very easy to understand terms, so that anybody, not just first responders, not just military members, but a random person on the street who has never even known one of us, will now see the true human side behind the badge and behind the uniform. It's together. And the thing is, usually you have to get a gut-wrenching, grueling story, and that's it, right? And you get that with this. Trust me, you will be on the edge of your seat the entire time. But you have the balance where the doc comes in and she brings you back in and lets you know, okay, this is why you're feeling this way. This is why this is impacting you in such a profound manner, right? And together we show a pathway to healing. We show that you can come out the other side of post-traumatic stress injury. I'm living proof of that. And so this book, I guarantee for anybody watching or listening, first of all, you won't be able to put it down. Second of all, it has the power to save your relationship, to save your career, and most importantly, to save your life.
Michael, that's exactly how I wanted to end this episode. One of the reasons why I wanted to interview you is not because of the trauma in the Air Force and in law enforcement, but because of the courage to go out and to tell your story. And countless people are being helped now. And I want people to hear just the fact that you are willing to share your story may save somebody's life, like John's attempted suicide saved your life, but it doesn't ever have to get to that point. So, when this episode is over with, we're going to give away a copy of your book. But I'm going to challenge everybody who's out there looking for something to read this summer. Go pick up a copy of Relentless Courage. We'll let everybody know at the end of this episode where they can find it. But the people that want to know more about you, how do they find out more about Michael Sugrue?
So I'm on every social media platform. Just type in Sergeant Michael Sugrue. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Twitter, Parler, Truth. I mean, you name it, I'm on there. And I check my messages daily. So please feel free to send me a message. And also, one thing I want people to watch, there's two things. I'm featured in a short film and a full-length documentary. The first one is called Stigma of Help. It's made by Mission 22, which is a nonprofit for combat veterans and first responders. Only 9 minutes, but again, very powerful. Stigma of Help. It's on YouTube. And the other one is a full-length documentary called Residual. And it's produced by Doug Haynes. And it came out about a year ago, and it features a bunch of different people, a bunch of different modalities and paths to healing, but both are extremely powerful. And if you read the book, I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear what you think about it, how it affected you. So please reach out and send me a message. And the last thing I want to tell people is that if you're not much of a reader like me, we have an audible version in our own voice.
There you go. Yep.
And you're going to hear Doc Freer, you're going to hear myself, and it's going to be straight from our heart and soul.
I'm going to give people that are driving right now, if you look at the description of this episode, we'll give you the links to Stigma of Help. We'll give you the links to Residual as well, because we want everybody to go check that out. Michael, I know you've got a very busy schedule, man. So thank you for carving out a little bit of time to be on the show. And thank you for standing up and just being honest and being totally open about getting to the point where I needed help. And that bravest moment of your life, I hope, will save somebody's life who's listening on this episode. Thanks, man.
Thank you, brother. I just want to thank you as well, brother to brother, because you're making a true difference and you're an absolute hero. You're an absolute inspiration, and you're saving lives still to this day, every single day. So thank you, brother.
My honor to be able to hear stories like yours on this episode, man. I really hope that this episode has got somebody's attention. I am praying that this interview with Michael saves somebody's life today, because maybe you will realize if a guy like Michael needs help, if a guy like John, his partner from Vietnam who served for 30 years in law enforcement, if he can get to the point of almost taking his own life, then maybe it can happen to me, and I need to reach out and get some help. So I'm going to say it again, just like I did in this episode. The bravest thing that you'll ever do is to say these 3 words: I need help, and to say it to somebody who cares enough that they'll get you some help. Hey, maybe you heard about this documentary called Residual. If you're looking for this documentary, in the notes to this episode, you can find a link to it. I've already watched this little short 9-minute YouTube clip called The Stigma of Help. I think it's an amazing video. Why don't you carve out 10 minutes sometime this week and watch that video? The link to that is in the description of this episode also. But I really want people to read his book. I want people to read his book so much that, you know how we do this around here, I'm going to pay for a copy and give it away to somebody who's part of the greatest podcast audience on the planet, the Unbeatable Army. And if you're not already part of the Unbeatable Army, it's totally free. All you got to do is just go over to unbeatablearmy.com. But somebody who's already a part of the Unbeatable Army is going to get a free digital copy of Michael's book called Relentless Courage. And I hope his story of frontline trauma will encourage you, or maybe some of the practical steps that you hear from the other voices in that book will help you. If you want to know more about Michael, we'll give you all of his links to social media right here in the description. But if you want to know more about this podcast, maybe you've just stumbled across this episode for the first time, why don't you go ahead and hit subscribe and start listening to future episodes, or go back and check through some pretty amazing stories in the past. You can also follow us on social media. Like Michael, we're out there pretty much everywhere. All you got to do is search for @Unbeatable Podcast, and you'll run into people out there on social media who are very connected, like Clayton Horn. Clayton, you are the fan of the week this week. Thank you, Clayton, for being so loyal, so connected. Thank you for the way that you engage with people on social media. And we wanted to honor you, recognize you. So you are our fan of the week this week. Listen, I hope that you heard something today that touched your heart. I hope that you go away from this episode a little bit stronger, a little bit better, or maybe with the courage that you need to say those 3 words to somebody: I need help. Thank you for joining me today. See you right back here next week. Have a great week, y'all.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.